Good morning. It's such a pleasure to be part of the conference today. My name's Donna Thomas, and I'm a research fellow based at the University of Central Lancashire, which is a place in the north of England. For the next 30 minutes, I'm going to talk about children's unexplained experiences and some research that I've been involved in for the last several years and some of the findings and how we might think about children's anomalous experiences in relation to self unconsciousness and ideas about the world too. My role at the university is a research fellow as part of a research centre that's specifically for children. And what that means is that children are really central to all the work that we do as a research centre. So the research prioritises children's agendas, what's important to children, and carries out studies in relation to education, well-being, health, environment, social work, and so on. We work with many partners, both nationally and internationally, such as the Council of Europe, NICE, which is the National Institute of Care Excellence, Barnardo's, and many others too. I lead on a strand of research which is rather a strategic priority that's concerned with exploring the nature of self and experience with children. Usually in social research and social science, when we explore experiences with not just with children but with adults, it tends to be the more mundane and everyday experiences, especially experiences that are intended to inform policy and practice. Where this is different is that we feel that it's important to understand and explore the wide spectrum of human experience, especially experiences often referred to as paranormal, exceptional, anomalous, as experiences that are not often attended to in social research. And that's where the talk, that's the context of where this research fits into. I think it's important to firstly define how I'm talking about children in the research, but also how I am thinking about the idea of unexplained experiences. As in most research practice, children as a research group are normally aged between 0 to 18 years, with the exception of children with special needs or disabilities that then tend to go up to 25 years. Now, there are clear differences between how a child of 3 and 4 years old and a child of probably 16, 17, 18 years old, more considered a young person at that age, experiences self, others, and the world. There are clear differences, and these differences are taken into account in the research that I conduct. Unexplained experiences is rather an abstract term, and I think it demonstrates the fact that I'm certainly grappling with what to call these experiences, and there are many labels such as paranormal, anomalous, exceptional. But when we start to explore these experiences with children, it becomes clear that they are quite common and quite what we would consider a normal aspect of childhood. The reason that I'm using the term unexplained experiences at the moment is it has wider connotations to how we understand subjective experience in and of itself. Even the most mundane experiences, everyday experiences, whether it's having a cup of tea or tasting water or going out with friends, it's not really explained. It still remains a mystery. You know, our mainstream materialist paradigm may have us believe that our subjective experiences arise from physical objects such as brains. And what the research shows with children, especially at the moment, is that might not be the case. In fact, it may show us that it's contrary to what the materialist and mainstream paradigm is actually showing us. So I stay there with the definition of unexplained experiences, but of course there are clear differences between what we would consider to be our mundane everyday experiences and those that are considered anomalous, exceptional, and paranormal. And the way I demarcate between those types of experiences is that an unexplained experience, anomalous experience, is one that tends to go beyond our usual definitions of personhood, time, and space. So examples might be out-of-body experiences, premonitions, telepathy, and so on. And these are the types of experiences that I do research with children, and I'm going to talk about today. Just to draw your attention to some of the pictures on this slide, these are actually examples of data. I do use art research methods with children that are very important, really, for allowing children to express experiences that they may not have the verbal capacities to express. I mean, even with adults, if we think about when adults try to convey a near-death experience or other kinds of paranormal experiences, these tend to be experiences that go beyond our linguistic capacities. The dualistic nature of language doesn't really have the words to enable us sometimes to share and talk about and represent these kinds of experiences. So these pictures you'll find dotted throughout the presentation. Before I start, I thought it might be nice to share a couple of examples of the kinds of experiences that my research is concerned with children. I see orbs and spirits as people and as outlines. I can sense illness with my hand and I can see people's auras. Most of the time, I don't mind when I see people because they don't mean any harm towards me. I can get a bit scared when they stare at me, but most of them disappear after a while. This quote is from a child aged 13 years from Sri Lanka, and it's a really good example of children's ethos almost towards unexplained experiences, in particular the negative experiences, which children are showing to have an awful lot of currently. There's a sense with children that these kinds of experiences have a very ephemeral quality, that they don't last very long, and that they will go, this too shall pass, in a sense. And that's very important, especially with negative experiences, for children's well-being, as we'll get into as we go along. Another example from a child with autism, aged 9, from Sweden. I cannot speak to people, but I can speak with spirits. Again, another good example of some of the really important findings that are coming out of not just my research, but past studies and other contemporary studies as well. The idea that nonverbal children may in some ways use different kinds of communication strategies, perhaps telepathy, perhaps it's engaging with beings other people cannot see, as a means for kind of compensating for any other, I don't like to say but any other kind of things that aren't there, whether it's verbal capacities and so on. The last example on the slide, I can see them with my physical eyes, I can speak to them and hear their response. This is an example from a child aged 12 from the USA, and that's connected to hearing voices. And, as we can see from the quote, this isn't just about hearing voices. This is about a child being in dialogue. So receiving responses from what the child considers to be a dead person. And what the child considers is really important in these research studies, because it's very much centered on the meanings that children are assigning to their experiences, rather than what the adult researcher might interpret from already theorized material in a sense. The picture is from a 17-year-old young person who is trying to depict her mediumship capabilities. And this is a visual representation of the helpful voices that she can hear that guide her in her life. So why is it important that we research unexplained experiences with children? There is so much I could say about this and talk around this slide in terms of the rationale for this work and why it's important. Firstly, it is an important topic, and it's a child-led agenda, which means it's something that's been identified by children as being important to research and explore. And this is probably because anomalous experiences, they're a large part of the journey of a child. They're quite common, and we don't listen to them, we don't research them often with children. It is an under-researched topic, especially if it's compared to the literature around adults and anomalous experiences. There's a wealth of very, very good literature and exceptional studies out there that deal with adults. And that's because I think that's something to do with how we understand the nature of child. Mainstream definitions of child tend to position children as becoming adults rather than beings in their own right, which in a way is suggesting that adults have capacities to engage in this kind of research and children may not, and that's highly debatable. There's a real blurring of boundaries between children's unexplained experiences and experiences that are often defined or synonymized with mental illness and mental disorder. And this is really problematic, as the research is starting to show. A good example of this is recent studies in the psychosocial fields that are exploring something called PSLEs, psychotic-like experiences. And studies have been done in adult and children populations around these experiences that carry the features of what we would consider psychosis and features of unexplained, anomalous, or paranormal experiences. But they are experiences that are not deemed important enough to be medicalized, so to have a diagnosis attached to them. And they are in populations that have not already been diagnosed with a medical condition. So they are quite mysterious. What the studies are showing is that these PLEs, these psychotic-like experiences, there's a higher incidence of them in children aged between 9 to 12 years. And this is a significant time in a child's life because it's a time of puberty, for example. It's a liminal space, a space of transition between one way of being into another. And there could be some links there between these kinds of experiences and children's ways of being in the world. The point being is that the boundaries between mental health disorders and children's unexplained experiences are very blurred. And that's probably a consequence of them not being explored with children. So that's a bit of a rationale. It is an under-researched topic in contemporary academia, but there are a lot of studies that happened in the past. And without labouring this too much, just to give a quick overview, and also just to note, this is from a literature review that is still ongoing. It's quite difficult to find literature around children and unexplained experiences, especially again compared to adults. But lots of studies took place between the 1950s and the 1980s. These were experimental studies, ESP-related testing with children, with school-age children, and mostly carried out in school contexts as well. As someone who's researched with children an awful lot in school contexts for over the last 20 years, there are a lot of significant issues with researching with children in schools, a lot of unspoken conventions, and a lot of socio-cultural factors and things like power relationships between adults and children that can interfere with this kind of testing. And I think this is something that Drucker, Drews and Rubin may have picked up on in 1977 when their studies, ESP-related studies with children, showed that children who were tested in their home environments scored better than children who were tested in school. And a lot of the studies from the past tended to look at cognitive variables such as IQ, learning and memory, and didn't really pay attention to the social and cultural influences that can intersect with children's anomalous experiences, and not just children's anomalous experiences, but also these are things that can intersect with our more mundane and everyday kinds of experiences as well. In the 1990s, there was more research around other kinds of unexplained experiences in children, such as mystical and peak experiences by scholars such as Ed Hoffman. And Drews and Drucker brought out a fabulous anthology that tried to capture and register all the previous studies around children and anomalous experiences, which again tended to be ESP-related experiences such as premonitions, PK, telepathy, and so on. Interestingly, as we head towards the 2000s, there seems to be a rupture in these kinds of studies that could be something to do with the rise of children's mental health services that was gaining a lot of investment at this point in time, and probably children's conditions added into the DSM around this time. Also a rise in psychosocial studies and how we were considering these experiences in children started to change, which may explain a rupture in these kinds of studies. In the 1980s, Susan Blackmore noted that despite there being quite a lot of studies that involved significant numbers of children, findings across these studies were quite inconsistent, and it was very difficult to replicate these studies with children. Now, the nature of these studies does require replicability, and if it's not the case, then maybe there's something about starting to look at, could this be a meaningful way or more a productive way to involve children in research concerned with anomalous, unexplained experiences. Some of the highlights from past studies are really important. It's important to consider, what worked well and what may not work so well, and what can we carry forward when we continue to research children's unexplained experiences. Well, past studies tended to include larger numbers of children, which I think is really important. And it's something that I find difficult to do in my own studies, simply because they are qualitative and participatory in nature, meaning that they're not designed for quantity, they're designed for quality. So there's smaller numbers of children involved, but there's more deeper explorations, and we can really start to consider the other social, cultural, and other factors around these kinds of experiences with children. A really significant finding that seems to cut across many of the studies is the question that it raises around, could ESP, for example, be an extension of our usual cognitive capabilities? And I kind of touched on this briefly at the start when I shared the quote of the nonverbal child who was expressing their experiences of engaging with unseen beings, for example. And this comes out strongly in past research, but it also comes out in more contemporary research. For example, Diane Hennessy-Powell's research with savant autistic children, exploring and testing around telepathy. And Hennessy-Powell shows that, there's telepathy with children's primary caregivers. So there's some connection between close relationships and these kinds of experiences. I also think it might start to show us something about the relationship between these kinds of experiences, consciousness, and who we are, so our senses of self. There's some valuable data shown around variables with younger children seem to be consistently scoring higher in ESP-related testing. Potential issues are concerned with maybe how children are positioned in this kind of research. And I think it's always difficult in experimental research. Human beings, are often positioned as research objects rather than active agents. And that's the very nature of these kinds of experiments. But in a sense, it does do a disservice to human beings and their experiences in the sense of objectification, for example, and passivity in research studies. There's also an issue around the measurement of subjective experiences and the question mark of, can we actually measure the immeasurable in terms of subjective experience? The nature of a lot of these experiments were based on traditional child Piagetian development models, which have been heavily criticised going forward. The reasons being is that these models tend to fix children's ways of being, places expectations on children that they have to reach, for example, a certain developmental stage. And if they don't, then there's something wrong, or there's a deficiency somewhere. But also it positions children as becoming adults rather than beings in their own right, with adults in a way being defined as being this pinnacle of somewhere we need to get to, very logic, very rational, and very capable, which then positions children as being not so capable. There was always a sense as well in the Piagetian model that children below the age of 7 didn't have the capabilities for rational, abstract, and logical thinking. And again, contemporary research is suggesting that also this might not be the case. This is dependent on our current definitions of logic and rationality and our understanding and valuing of certain kinds of knowledges, which tends to be the statistical, the mathematical languages, and so on. So I can't go into that too much here, but it's just an interesting point and something that, again, needs to be thought about in future studies. I think I've already mentioned probably a lack of attention paid to the social cultural factors, and the idea that findings are contradictory may kind of suggest that we do need to involve children in this kind of research in different ways, which is something what I certainly do in my own research studies. So there are many research studies that are taking place at the moment. Some are ongoing, some have completed. I don't have time to go over all of them in this talk, but what I thought was just to give you a couple of example studies. I wanted to include this one. It is at its early stages, but it's such an exciting study. And, who knows, hopefully I can come back next year and just focus on this study and the findings that are coming out from this. It's took 12 months to get the ethics through, so that's an awful long time. And it's because it is such a sensitive study. And it's about researching younger children's unexplained experiences following cardiac arrest and resuscitation. And children in these studies are extremely sick. Some of them have, died not just once, but several times. And they are currently in intensive care units at Great Ormond Street Hospital in London. The idea being that we engage children using these participatory methods to really get a sense of the experiences that they are having. Initial anecdotal evidence points to experiences that carry the qualities of things like near-death experiences, out-of-body experiences, visions, and so on, that are often labelled medically under the term delirium, which is really unfortunate because there's not many opportunities to explore these experiences with children themselves. So this is what this research is about. It also considers catalysts, potential catalysts and contexts in this research. So for example, ketamine is used extensively with these children. And so it's important to consider, especially in light of all the research and studies around the relationship between ketamine and unexplained experiences and states of consciousness and so on. It's important to think about that in this study too. And that's why we've enlisted other scholars to help, such as David Luke, who's an expert in ketamine, for example, and anomalous experiences, to kind of advise and help shape this study too. That's one example. Another example is a program rather than a study. So it's a program of research that has several smaller studies within that program. Part of this is an international online questionnaire that's being distributed across 5 countries at the moment. And that's just a way for us to gather some statistical data around frequency of experiences, types of experiences children are having, but also importantly to try to gather some information about the cultural context and how those factors might influence children's experiences, the meanings children assign to their experiences, and very importantly, how adults are responding to children's unexplained experiences, because this makes a world of difference between whether children are well or whether they suffer with their unexplained experiences. Part of this program is to also conduct individual interviews with children in different contexts. So more natural environments such as homes. We've done some interviews outside in nature, some in schools and other contexts where children go, such as youth centres. And we've also done group interviews or group research activities, especially with younger children, mainly at the moment in school contexts. The cyberethnography aspect of this program is extremely interesting and is generating an awful lot of anecdotal data or qualitative data, narrative data might be a better word, around children's unexplained experiences, a wide variety of them. Also, parents reporting their younger children's experiences online and also their own experiences from childhood. So there's a real interesting mix going on online. There's a lot of ethical procedures around this. So it's very easy for a researcher to go onto such a rich site and just pull information from these sites. But there is a protocol to this where, we do have to approach people and ask if we can take their examples and for the purposes of and thereof. And people are quite open to this and are happy to share. They're sharing anyway online, but they're happy to share for the research as well. When we get to sites such as TikTok, which are very much child-led and teenager-led, something different is happening where there seems to be a real resistance being shown from children aged between 8 to 18 years, a resistance to normative ways for describing and thinking about unexplained experiences, which tends to be the dominant mental health narrative. Tweens, which is a kind of a term coined for children 8 to 12 years old, are attempting to do their own experiments, paranormal experiments, such as using ghost boxes, ghost hunting, Ouija boards, water experiments, and so on. Extremely worrying, especially from the perspective of a parent. But from the point of view of research, it's really interesting to see these resistances, to see these capabilities, though, as well, and for children just to kind of want to really get to understand maybe their own experiences, but maybe other people's experiences too. There are other studies in development that are expanding on these too. Again, something I might be able to come back and talk about next time. So there are, as you can imagine, there are many data sets that are produced from all the different studies that I've tried to talk about here. What I've decided to do for the purposes of this talk is just to try to synthesize things down and for us to think about some of the main points that are coming out of the different research studies. And I've tried to do this by demarcating between ages and also thinking about differences between children who have medical conditions and who don't have medical conditions. And there are hardly any differences, which is quite interesting. That, children with and without medical conditions seem to have similar types of experiences that carry the same qualities of experience too. The only difference being lucid dreams, which is interesting. So children without medical conditions such as epilepsy, narcolepsy, they tend to report a lot of lucid dreams, where children with medical conditions, they don't seem to report many. So that was just a difference, kind of a deviation in the thematic data that's emerging from these studies. But as you can see, very similar experiences really across all the age groups, a difference between the younger and the older in terms of peak and mystical experiences. And again, I think that's something to do with children this age having this kind of more meta consciousness to be able to identify a rupture in their sense of self and a difference in the way that they're experiencing the world. And I think with younger children, it's kind of more of a given, more of a matter of fact. I'm starting to feel that it's just their natural way of being in the world is kind of this peak in the moment, almost mystical type of experiencing. There are different activities that might catalyze some of these experiences, and I can't go through all of them now. I know that I'm running out of time, but just to bring your attention to video gaming, because it's such an interesting activity, recent studies are showing that there's a correlation between teenagers who are video gaming and the frequency of lucid dreams that they're starting to have. There's also research that's showing that states of consciousness in video gaming are very similar to states of consciousness achieved in meditation and activities such as yoga nidra. So there's something about catalyzing a state of consciousness that may be then more amenable to experiencing the types of experiences that are detailed here as well. So I just thought that's an interesting point. And just across that, the higher incidence of children puberty age reporting different kinds of anomalous experiences was clear. And across the data set, there are more older children than younger children involved, but not that many more. So it's not a significant enough number at the moment to start to kind of analyze that in more detail too. It's important before we finish just to note the relationship between how children sense their self, their ways of being, and their unexplained experiences. And during, through all these studies, we always explore the nature of self too. And we do that either experientially through certain research methods that I don't have time to talk about now, but also through the kinds of experiences that children are reporting, especially experiences such as peak and mystical. The transpersonal self on this diagram is the aspect of self that you'll find these kinds of experiences. And this is an aspect of self that seems not individual, very connected to others in the world. And instances of experiences at this level of self would be things like telepathy, feeling other people's feelings in the body, senses of being stirred at, and so on. And these are the kinds of experiences that are reported at the level of the transpersonal self. Time isn't chronological, it becomes spatial, especially when children start to try to talk about things like exceptional dreams and out-of-body experiences. And the other interesting aspect of self here is something with what children referred to as a knowing aspect of all their experiences, which I've referred to as the knowing I. And this knowing element of experience seems to have some kind of correspondence with a sense of I or me-ness or self. And it's a sense that cannot be narrativized. It cannot be described using words. And children just refer to it as, I don't know, but I just know, and I just know it's me. And it's very difficult to describe, and it's almost like a field of subjectivity in and of itself. But it's really important, I think, to flag up the relationship between self and unexplained experiences, especially because it does act as a bridge between unexplained experiences and theories and philosophies that are important, because these experiences are really challenging our mainstream ideas about the world, or the materialist paradigm that really does have a hegemony over academia, and not just over academia, but over people's everyday living experiences and systems that are there to support people within the everyday. So it's problematic, and children's ways of being are really challenging that mainstream materialist paradigm. And it's important that we start to include children in any development, in any thinking around where do we go from here in terms of challenging this paradigm. Children's ways of being and activities may be correlated with high instances of unexplained experiences. And I've just briefly mentioned that in terms of referring to the video gaming and states of consciousness, but also there's something about children and play. We still don't really understand what play is. If you're a social constructionist, you might think of play as an activity where children will mimic adults. And I think there is an aspect of that in play, but there's also an awful lot we don't know about play. We know that it doesn't depend on the size of the brain, because honeybees play and octopi, we now know, do play. And it's very difficult to understand in terms of neuroscience where in the brain, which neural correlates light up when children play. There's not a lot of data around that yet either. Also, we know that there's a big release of dopamine when children play that's very consistent and similar to when adults meditate. So there's something to do with connections between play and states of consciousness. And certainly the studies with younger children are showing that play may be a catalyst for some of these unexplained experiences. I think children do draw attention to the mind-body problem. Children are very embodied in the world. In this, I think what Bernard Carr refers to as a specious present. They are so in the moment. That doesn't mean that these experiences are physical. For me, I think this means we need to really also redefine what we mean by physical and what we mean by matter. And I think children could be very helpful in those redefinings and definitions. Can children's ways of being, experiences, and insights contribute to developing theories? I believe that they can. Within this post materialist scholarship that's emerging in philosophy and science, I think that children are overlooked, and I feel that children could have a really important role in helping us to think about the nature of reality, the nature of what we are as human beings, and the nature of consciousness, and how all those things interrelate. It's clear that the materialist paradigm cannot explain children's ways of being or their experiences. In fact, what it does, it denies them. So then we have to think about turning to other ways of understanding reality, understanding who we are as human beings. And there are many other philosophies and ways of thinking and models of the world that are emerging now. Again, there isn't time to try to talk about the different aspects of these, but the two popular ones at the moment appear to be panpsychism and idealism, both, I feel, which carry potentials for being able to explain children and their experiences in better and more logical ways. Both of these philosophies have problems, and they're problems that are very much concerned with the self. So for panpsychism, the problem is, how do many subjects that are assumed to exist within the smallest aspects of material, which is things like atoms and particles, how do they come together to create a subject, a big subject like you or I? And in terms of idealism, how does one big subject decompose into many subjects? And these are philosophical problems, and they're all connected to the self. Currently in panpsychism, there's kind of a move to do away with the self, because if we do away with the self, then we don't have to address the subject combination problem. The issue with that is that in children's living experiences, there is a sense of self. Yes, we might see through what we might refer to as a narrative or an illusory sense of self, but there is something else beyond that children do identify in a subjective way, that knowing element of experience that seems to be an aspect of self. So to do away with self might not cut it in terms of explaining children's experiences and ways of being. In terms of idealism, there are some aspects of idealism, for example, such as Kastrup's analytical idealism, that doesn't do away with the self, that tends to explain subjectivity as a shared field in which all experience is known, or which is the dative of all subjective experience. And certainly for me, I think it does carry an awful lot of potential for us to start to reconsider children and their anomalous experiences. And again, across sciences and quantum mechanics, quantum physics, models of entanglement and non-locality, explorations into time and the mind-body problem, I think all carry potentials for helping to explain children and their experiences. But more importantly, I think children have the potential to help scientists explain their theories, which is a huge point of the whole talk today. To quickly summarise, younger and older children do commonly have unexplained experiences, experiences that go beyond our usual definitions of personhood, time and space, that really do present a challenge to the materialist paradigm. There's blurred boundaries between children's unexplained experiences and mental health disorders, and this really does need addressing. Children are absolutely suffering. They're medicalised, silenced, and at the very worst, incarcerated for their experiences. So we do need a better understanding of these experiences in childhood. And we do need children to be part of that re-examination of our mainstream paradigm, materialist paradigm, and the importance of this work for social transformation is key. As a research centre, much of our research with children does inform policy and practice in very positive ways that can impact not just on the lives of children, but on services that are designed to support children. And the hope with this research is that it can, in time, at the minute it is a little bit controversial, but in time can start to help to change policy and practice. Thank you so much for listening. Please do feel free to contact me. My details are to the left of the screen. And just to flag up that the ideas that I have touched on very briefly in this presentation are in much more detail in a new book that I do have coming out, hopefully towards the end of this year with John Hunt Publishing, and that the title are Children's Unexplained Experiences in a Post Materialist World.